The following is an analysis of prevalence of reference to the 3 Bs, as they have been called playfully by musicologists, of classical music. The study has been aided and abetted by Google NGrams. The 3 Bs in question that we are going to study are Johann Sebastian Bach, Ludwig van Beethoven, and Johannes Brahms, all pictured here. Now, a little derivation of the term, the 3 Bs, it was coined by Peter Cornelius in an 1854 article for a Berlin music magazine. Originally, however, the 3 Bs were Bach, Beethoven, and Hector Berlioz, a French contemporary composer of Cornelius himself. However, Berlioz was replaced with Brahms by the conductor Hans von Bülow, who stated in the 1880s that he believed in Bach the Father, Beethoven the Son, and Brahms the Holy Ghost of music. Now, it should be noted, before we proceed, that there is a common taxonomic delineation between the different eras within what is commonly known as classical music. As music is much older than the earliest time frame of Baroque 1600 stated, and goes past the 20th century as of now, it was only included those eras which would be recognized by the, say, less educated listener to the field as classical music. The Baroque, the Classical, and the Romantic eras. The Baroque era lasted from about 1600 to 1760, and the 3B that falls into this era is Bach, who died in 1750, and with him the Baroque era. The Classical era, from 1735 to 1825, was marked namely by the 3rd B, Beethoven, who was a transitional composer, who is also often considered a romantic composer, but largely his influence has been classical. He died in 1827. And finally, the Romantic era was marked by Brahms, who died in 1897, so he is almost approaching the 20th century, but he is still considered a romantic composer based on the nature of his music, which is darker, more brooding, and more emotional. Now that there is some context of the time frame of all these 3 composers, it's time to consider the Google NGrams. Here is a plot of the references in both periodic and literary works to the 3 composers listed. It should be noted that anything that falls outside the composer's timeline, that is, before they existed, not after, for example, a reference to Beethoven in around 1575, should be disregarded completely, as in Beethoven was only born in 1770. This is additionally true for Brahms, who it can be seen along the Brahms curve there are several spikes before his birth in 1833. And these are, of course, not to be taken as Johannes Brahms, the composer, but another German Brahms of the time. However, even though Bach was born in 1685, there are some references to Bach that could be referring to his ancestry, namely, around the 1550s and later, where Veit Bach was a Hungarian-based composer who was the first in the Bach family to start composing music, 100 years before Bach himself. And just before Bach's birth in 1685, his father, Johann Ambrosius Bach, was also a prevalent composer and town musician. Other things to consider around the curve are the revival of Bach, which came at around this time on the curve, close to 1829. For on March 11th, 1829, Felix Mendelssohn, a composer in his own right, performed Bach's St. Matthew Passion and brought him forward out of obscurity. It is also to be considered the incredible spike in popularity that occurred with Beethoven around the 1950s, in that he was used as somewhat of a pincushion, so to speak, by popular artists and so-called revolutionaries in the music era at the time. Roll over Beethoven was a common expression that essentially dismissed the classical era composers and their accomplishments in order to usher in a new era of music. That is, rock and roll, and the rise of modern music as we know it today. A Fifth of Beethoven is another common popular song that was written and played around this time, but more in the 60s and 70s, hence his spike in popularity here, presumably. The last and potentially most disturbing trend to witness is this dramatic increase of all of these composers' prevalence just before 1950. This is because all three of these composers were very well known as German composers, and during the Third Reich and Hitler's domination, they were considered national heroes of Germany in a way, and that they were German cultural icons that were lauded and raised up by the Nazi regime. This, I believe, not only led to an increase in their reference in the works of the time, even if it is from the corpus English, as we were examining what happened with the rise of the Nazi regime, slightly delayed after the end of the war, closer to 1950 than its start in 1940 based on the graph, it also seems to be part of their imminent decline. All the composers face a rather steep decline around this era, not just because of a rather commonly held sentiment, I would presume, that it were the old values that had led to the last two world wars and should be abandoned thusly for the new era, as previously mentioned, of rock and roll and new pop culture, but also that such composers could have potentially been considered by the ignorant to be German composers. That is, although they are German composers in some way associated with the atrocities committed and the conquests laid down by the Nazi regime. Thank you for listening. I hope that it was entertaining in some way and informative. These were the 3 B's of classical music.